So welcome everyone to our special guest lecture presentation for the RAMP pilot program. We are absolutely blessed today to have Bruce Maynard come and chat with us about his wealth of expertise around no-kill cropping and no doubt some other things that are going to blow my mind. Before we do make a formal start, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we work today and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this meeting. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters of New South Wales. If you want to, you can pop your country in the chat. I'm meeting on Bundjalung country, or the Bundjalung Nation. And I would just like to take one brief minute to introduce Bruce. I've borrowed this bio from the Farming Secrets website, but it really blows my mind to even get a sense of what Bruce has accomplished in his time, and it's just so humble about it all. So Bruce is no doubt one of Australia's leading agricultural innovators. Over 30 years, he's pioneered the fields of no-kill cropping, stress-free stockmanship, self-herding and grassland grain. Implementing on his own farm as well as supporting landholders across Australia, he continues to extend constructive practices for local communities and landscapes that have global impacts. He invented no-kill cropping as a response to the current and emerging challenges unique to Australian farming. No-kill cropping and pasture cropping are systems that grow crops within grasslands rather than replacing grasslands as conventional systems do. These methods are adaptable and resilient, providing profitable production while slashing input and therefore risk. Bruce has also developed stress-free stockmanship, an approach that changes the interactions between people, animals and the landscape. It is more than animal handling, but a way to enable animals to initiate new learned behaviours that positively impact people and landscapes. Bruce, absolute pleasure to have you with us, and I'll hand over to you now, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simone, for that very lovely welcome, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Just do a sound check with Simone now. Is that an okay volume? Great, lovely. Well, without any further ado, let's jump into this session. We'll go through just only a little bit of a taste of today, but on the considerations that you might put across not only no-kill cropping, but also across any cropping system or combination of systems that you might be thinking of employing or that you're actually analysing. So the quote there from Ralph Waldo Emerson, I think, is quite apt, because if we are to really be able to judge whether no-kill cropping or conventional cropping or anything in between has validity for not only your land that you're managing as a whole, but individual parts of it, then we really need to think about principles and processes. Next, please, Simone. So just a fraction about me, because we really like today to be about you guys discussing with me, interacting on these issues, but I've been very, very fortunate to have the opportunity to have an extended period of time of travelling down a river of innovation, and straight away I must say you always stand on the shoulders of giants, so there's too many people to and influences to indicate to in my journey as far as the foundations, and I have innovated a few things along the way, and hopefully more to come. But that isn't the end of it. We're all going to be innovators together in this great enterprise of moving forward and addressing the challenges rather than avoiding the challenges of our time. And it's the creative endeavours that we join in with along that journey that really excite me and give me a passion. Well, I am very much a person of my place in that I grew up in a smallish community of Narromine in central New South Wales. And I very much believe in trying to develop up systems that support local communities and keep people on the land and keep connection with country in the more broad sense, as we're only just present custodians along our way. And if we can do a good job of it in our current generations, then we're going to provide the basis for all of our descendants and everybody that we know and love. Next. So a little title I've thrown in for today's seminar is Will We Crop Until We Drop? And I mean by that, in addressing our worldwide and global influences that I've listed, of just a few there, as well as George Monbiot's quote about how our agricultural systems affect everything else. Obviously, agriculture and farming is the bedrock of modern civilizations and societies, and a lot of what we have been doing is now starting to play out at large scale. And with some of that, of course, that's been very, very negative. And if anybody were to say, well, so what, that we've lost a few insects or a few fish or birds or animals, well, so what? The world still keeps turning. And yes, it does. But on a narrower foundation than we can potentially keep. And that is the creative part that I'd like to keep on alluding to, is that as we go forward, how about thinking, instead of narrowing the base of our foundations, that we actually make that foundation as broad as possible and start to reverse some of those trends that you see listed in species decline. Because in my view, species decline is inherently linked with climate change and community survival and thriving into the future. And everything is interlinked in great big giant spider webs. And I think we can excitingly do some things that reverse those negative trends while still, as humans, obtaining what we need at the same time. Next. So just a little bit more of, if you like, the push factors that now the changes in climate are quite measurable, and so all of us have a responsibility, but also an opportunity to address those things. Just because we do have challenges doesn't mean that it's all negative. It can become a larger and larger negative for us if we do not address the fact that we are part of the whole system. And of course, us humans in general, of course, are a major driver of so many of the trends around our world now. And that is our positive chance for us to do a great difference and make a difference. It might be on one farm at a time or one individual at a time, but that's all the chance that we need. Next. And when we look at agricultural systems in general, it's just time for us to reflect a bit about that, about energy flows and nutrient flows and the overlapping economic implications of that. So a reasonable sort of small definition there that I use is on regenerative ag is the maximising of local ecological functions, where you actually grow not only the number of species, but the mass over time of those species, but without increasing the reliance on outside inputs to get that result. In essence, agroecology expands the basis about making that function more effectively, because resources are going to be different in different places, and of course seasons are different in different places. But with all of that, one can still maximise that, and diversity is about that maximisation. Next. So we are diving in fairly deeply here at the moment, and I'm giving you things in principle, and that's very deliberately, because very often when various things are discussed in agriculture, the discussions quickly fall down to practices within larger systems. And so the pressures externally on individual farmers right around the world is to keep on growing productivity, and that has come with an associated increase in their number of inputs and amount of inputs. And this is particularly true of Western agricultural systems. At the meantime, simultaneously, I should say, is that excuse me for that sound, that profitability and rural communities and the environmental factors, when measured by multiple standards, have been declining at the same time that agriculture has become hugely productive with a huge need for a lot of inputs. So my suggestion to you is that really, what do we want in life? If we're living in rural communities, we want our farming enterprises to be more profitable. We want our communities to continue to thrive so that they can equally support rural and farming life. And we want our environment to be better. So if we want all of those things, then we need to fundamentally think of something different than the usual approach, which is just to continually seek and grow more, but using more from outside the immediate resources. So it's actually flipping the trend is what I'm suggesting there. Next. So what agricultural methods can restore landscape function? And what we mean there by landscape function definitionally is the wide range of things. So it isn't just about soil, and it isn't just about plants or animals or birds or even humans. It's about the whole thing working together and expanding in a beneficial way. So over the years, lots of terms are washed through as far as people attempting to do better things in agriculture, or different than the conventional. And so, if you're old as me, then you have seen these trends go through for conservation farming, and then sustainable farming was a buzzword for a very long time, and now regenerative. And by all means, it's lovely that at the current time, regenerative is as a word is what we see a wave of interest in. But down right at the field level, the question is, do they? Are practices in alignment with known principles and observed processes in a natural sense, so that they are really regenerative? Because anybody can self-identify as doing regenerative things nowadays. Well, just because of that, there is no line for you to judge things by. But what I would suggest is, are the practices being put forward in anything that you're looking at feeding into natural processes that head us towards principles? Are they really driving towards that, or are they just simply papering over or partly getting there? One thing about this you'll see from me is that there's no need to deride certain practices if they're parts of the broader whole of society. So there's still going to be need for very intensive agriculture in places, but if it's in appropriate scale and appropriate places, then that won't be taking our landscape downwards too much. Next. So when we're going to change, or we're examining any system, and today we'll be looking just in brief at how no-kill cropping operates out in the real world. Well, is any change transformational or is it incremental? Both are good. You don't want to knock anybody for making a change that drives in a positive direction. But we do need to recognise how big or small that change is. We can use the tools at our disposal for polishing things or completely overturning things. And so that exists on a scale, and we can do that on anything that we're doing. So that's a never-ending improvement cycle. Next. And a short slide here. I don't expect you to be reading all those small words on the screen there. I'm just pointing out a broader agroecology view of the world and which factors come into it. And they've identified in this agroecology 13 major principles, which we won't go through, but there's a lot in there because that's true of farming. It's one of the most exciting, creative crafts in essence, because it can influence so many things. It just doesn't end at your own farm boundary. It can provide good much beyond what you're doing for your own personal purposes and paying the bills, which are all important, but our effects go way, way beyond, and that is one of the very, very positive things. Next. So when we're thinking about a cropping system and we're just seeing what's happening out in the field, I've got two very small representative photos there, and one is a conventional field, and these are both from Australia. Conventional field on the left, being tilled again, and dust and fines from that soil resource are obviously blowing away in the wind, and so therefore that process of growing that crop at that time on that place is inherently going to be degrading that soil resource. Now, that won't matter how much fertiliser we pop on that, because what is being removed in those fines is an accumulation of that the biology has used to actually make that topsoil. And it doesn't matter what fertiliser you buy, it won't be fully replacing what is going off. And then on the right-hand side, you've got the other end of the scale, where it's a picture of Michael Inwood, who lives at Bathurst, who approximately a decade ago was a very early pioneer in applying no-kill cropping, and he made himself an electric ute way ahead of current times, and he would do his sowing of his no-kill crops, and still does, with that electric-powered ute, which the batteries of which were powered by the sun. So quite a big difference in the scales there. On the left-hand side, it's all fossil, non-renewable fossil fuels being used and a soil resource going down. On the right-hand side, you've got renewable energy used to keep everything in place and actually keep on layering and making more of that grassland system. And everything varies in between and overlays. There's no static point. There's no exact good or bad. And so that's what we'd like you to keep on viewing when we're talking about systems change. It is very much about being able to pretend you're an analyst from outside, and you're critically judging all claims and how the components of any system work. Because we don't want to be zealots on anything as much as possible. Any system is a toolbox with tools in it. Your situation is that you should use the toolbox that are useful for you and the tools that are useful for you in combination and at different times with different ones and in the combinations that make sense for you. Next. So when we're looking at these different systems, there's all sorts of different titles of systems, and I've only listed a few here, and these are all dryland cropping systems for the sake of today's work, but on a bit of a framework here from full tillage at the top to no-kill cropping at the bottom. And I've listed them there that way because full tillage is maximum disturbance of a field situation, and no-kill cropping is minimum disturbance. So there's a range there that I've overlaid on those systems, and that isn't a judgments on that there. That is just a more looking at it from a disturbance point of view, and we're going to be looking at even more characteristics of cropping systems, because it isn't just a matter of, well, here's the good and here's the bad, because it isn't as simple as that. Next. And because the majority of you listening live today will be have come out of 2 pilot programs being taught holistic management principles, I thought it would be interesting to look at Alan Savory's cropping principles, much less well known than the principles and practices that he has for grazing management. I think that list on the left, which come out of his 4 editions of his book that's largely remained unchanged, are a pretty good set of indicators and instructions on what a cropping system would do. And we don't have time today to go through the full background of each of those, because those simple statements are actually the tip of a very large iceberg of good science driving underneath all of those principles. So his quote on the right-hand side on greater complexity is something very much that I try and engineer with no-kill cropping. And it did require a combination of new technologies and a look at the whole system as it evolved, rather than just any one part. Next. So just again, last slide on principles here, before we go into some more specifics about examining the no-kill cropping system, is that along with Savory's suggestions of larger cropping principles, there's a list on the left, and in no way exhaustive, to the list of considerations that one would put against any cropping system to decide whether that should be implemented on large or small part on your properties. And so the picture on the right that has 3 sets there right side by side, which is great for you to see. You've got a pasture cropping crop sown, an unsown strip that is in a triangular shape in the centre of the picture, and the no-kill cropping strip to the right. So if we're just viewing that alone and not knowing any of the base detail, it would be very much obvious that you would pick the pasture cropping part as your choice on the left, because it's obviously grown more grain than the unsown grassland there in front, or the no-kill cropping, but one would need to know what had fed into those to make a judgment on any one of those. In a year such as that pictured, it could well be that you're better off not to have sown anything, but it might be that your no-kill was a better choice, or pasture cropping, or something else. We want to make sure that just because I've developed a radically different system, that you don't believe for a moment that you can't be an analyst yourself, because I would much rather that people utilise the toolboxes that are appropriate for themselves. And as long as we recognise the componentry that we're doing for little disturbance or a lot of disturbance to our natural ecosystems, then we can use that in the most judicious ways. Next. And so with no-kill cropping, Simone, I'll just get you to click on the picture, please, and that should operate a video there for people to watch this tractor, and we've embedded it this way so that those of you that don't have so good internet might have an opportunity. It's not playing in this spot yet.
I'll just, Bruce, I might just have to reshare so that I have the sound included. So I'll just be a minute.
And this bit of film is taken from 2021, and it's just a modern tractor and air seeder implements that have been modified to be able to sow a no-kill crop. And this is going into a native and naturalised grassland in central west New South Wales on my property. And indeed, it's actually my son driving the tractor, and he's more fond of mechanicking than me, so he gets to drive the tractor. And we may be having some trouble playing that. If that remains the case, we'll move on. Oh, good, it's starting to play at this end. Thanks, Simone. So as this the tractor goes forward, you can see that the seed is actually getting placed there without destroying or disturbing the plants that are in situation there. And when it goes off, you can see that it is quite difficult to see where it's actually been, because we're doing the most minimal intervention that we can to actually place the seed in the ground. And thereby, the whole grassland is able to continue to function and remain, which is quite radically different than conventional and ancient tillage systems, where you would eliminate all the other plants by tillage, and then in modern days they do that with chemicals, and in order to grow the maximum of the individual plant that you are planting. No-kill cropping operates on a complementarity basis, not a competition basis. So we're utilising the fact that every grassland has annuals as a component in its annual growth phases. And so all we're doing is placing in that grassland our desirable annual, with annuals that we get to make some money from. Next. And so this adding of annuals into the landscape adds, in my terms, a fourth layer. So there's a picture from my place where on the right and far left there are rows of shrubs, and they're actually a native Australian shrub, Atriplex nummularia, which is called Old Man Saltbush, common language, and trees in the background. And underneath the growing crop there, in about the middle of the winter, is a perennial grassland in the same way that what you've just seen on the last video remaining. So we've got 4 layers of plants there operating. So we have the grassland operating for itself. The shrubs are in the landscape, the trees is the third layer, but then we're adding a desirable annuals that we can make money over the top. So it's not just about cropping here as well. If you think about animals operating in that landscape, not only the ones we get to make money from livestock and so forth, but think about all sorts of organisms can operate in a landscape with so much complexity versus a more simplified one or an completely unaltered one, which would just be a grassland. Next. And so some snapshots here of just various different times of growth, what the machines can go through. Looking, those top couple of photos was where I began with no-kill cropping back in 1996. I actually really wanted to get off the rigmarole of buying lots of diesel, so I started to tow around the cedar with my Navara ute, as you can see in the picture there. And so that's what I used to sow crops for over 20 years. And interestingly too, a question that often come up, well, how did your ute go? Did you wear out the ute? Well, it's now 18 years old, still on the place. It was registered for 17, so we didn't pull the back end out of that either. And a big reason for that is that, as you saw in the prior film, everything is rolling, and we are actually doing cropping when it is dry, when the soil is at its utmost strength, rather than wet sowing when it is most prone to damage. So our cropping regime is not exerting any compactive forces other than on a very surface level down through the soil layers. So we start to avoid a lot of things that are addressed in other ways in conventional systems. Next. And you can use no-kill cropping not only in pursuit of growing a crop, but also as beginning the change for very, very degraded sites. So Simone, I'll ask you to mute the video on the right, but see if that video will play. And if you could mute the sound, that would be good, and we'll continue to talk over the top of it if the video decides to play. If not, we will continue to move on. All great. So here is an example of the ute sowing through a grassland, and that's just a very old modified combine, and you can see the amount of material that these units can go through. So a grassland can remain intact while you grow a crop, which is so very exciting because it utterly changes the game we're playing. Traditionally, if one was making a choice to go cropping, that would mean that you would be taking the paddock out of its grazing regime. You couldn't have both. No-kill allows you to be able to do both at the same time. So within a year, you get to grow whatever the grassland can produce, plus a layer of cream, if you like, on top of the cake by growing a crop in amongst the grassland. And some of the close-ups here are me pointing out that the slots here in the grass are so hard to find that it's actually difficult to see where you go. Modern GPS systems help out a lot in that, but pointing out that the disturbances remain really, really tiny, and so the scale of application of no-kill can be large or small depending upon your property size. So you've seen both ends of that scale. Next. And over time, and you may need to click again, please. Thank you, Simone. it does start to radically change the way the soil operates as the whole biology begins to change. And that example there of my place to an immediately neighbouring property almost looks like two different soil types. You can hardly believe that they are actually the same soil type. But that's a cumulative thing over time. But no-kill is an interesting way of adding a much faster rate of progress than one can get through grazing changes alone, and also economic bonuses along with that more rapid change. We're all about just trying to grow more plants on top of the ground, which of course change the soil underneath the ground. And if we don't disturb and overutilize those paddocks, then they will change to be more biologically active. There's no other alternative than that progress to happen. Next. So here's another couple of photos for you to show it doesn't matter where you are on the scale. Don't be afraid of applying this sort of a tool if you're starting from a very, very degraded spot. On the left, the sodic soils out west of my property, and then on the right is a couple of hours east of where I live on a degraded hill, where in the first year of sowing, these pictures are both of oats just being sown into degraded sites. The amount of growth there isn't, if you're looking at it from a cropping or a yield perspective, isn't terribly impressive, but that isn't the point. The point on that particular patch of ground is that you're bringing it back into production at a really ultra low cost, and you're bringing it back without risking those sites degrading any further. If one were to apply conventional farming on those sites, one would have a risk there that if you did not grow more plants than you had disturbed and destroyed in the application, you're actually going backwards further again. So no-kill provides an opportunity in areas where you may not be actually seeking a commercial crop, but you may be seeking to actually regenerate a patch of land and start a process of plant growth that is very difficult to initiate in other ways, even with good grazing management. Next. And another comparison photo here for you of an extremely degraded site in the Murchison, just south of the Murchison area in Western Australia. So almost getting onto the edge of the rangeland and agricultural zones. And this paddock was a completely degraded, flogged out holding paddock for next to a shearing shed for over 100 years. And the owner had planted some trees, you can see, in strips, but the whole ground surface was like that open area that you see. And then he has planted 2 strips of no-kill in there. And that's a side-by-side comparison. Apply it or don't apply it in that circumstance and see how much more biomass you can get. And that's a restart on that paddock for 100 years of degrading influences to actually start flipping the coin back to the other direction, to soil being reformed again. Next. And often get asked, well, what would happen in a drought? Yeah, well, absolutely. You're not going to grow as much biomass in a drought. It is just very, very simple, of course, that if you do not have enough moisture for plant growth, you cannot grow so many or as much biomass. So the top left picture is of a drought year. So is that exact same year and with the picture underneath and to the right where it's being measured. So the top left-hand picture is where there has been no-kill crops, oats sown in that year. And then the bottom picture is immediately beside where it was sown. So contrast there again in a tough year of growing some biomass or not. And if one's really desperate in those years, any amount of extra biomass can really make a difference on a whole of farm basis. But one of the planks of no-kill is that it is an exceedingly cheap thing to be done when done properly. Sometimes people will overspend, and that would miss the point of no-kill cropping. Next. And when we're looking into the future, well, here's a couple of pictures of my son, who's the one busily planting all the crops on our place. The one on the right was when he was 14, when he bought himself his own first header to go cropping. And then on the one on the left was when he was 16 in a year that had lots and lots of moisture. So you can see there is a difference. You're going to ride that roller coaster of seasonal fluctuations with no-kill more so than conventional cropping, because we're not eliminating other things. But isn't it impressive there on the left? He's holding an oat plant up and he's almost obscured there, and his height, if you're wondering in the old terms, is just about 6 foot. So pretty impressive for a crop that received no fertiliser, no chemicals, no assistance whatsoever, other than to be sown effectively into a grassland. So it's really quite impressive how much that can be produced on this, but it makes absolutely natural sense if you view landscapes about how much biomass they do fluctuate with and impressively produce in wet years. Next. So how does it work? We don't have time today to go through all of the principles. Later on in the year, we will be restarting more courses Australia-wide in instructions on adopting no-kill cropping. But essentially, what you do with it is you give the crop that you plant a head start above the other germinating annuals in that system. So the top there is cowpeas and lablab and sorghum, and you can see how those two plants have bounded out from being sown versus the weeds next to it. And the bottom picture is oats growing through heavy clover and barley grass competition. They've got out of the starting blocks early, so that's why they can compete and work within the grassland system. Next. So multiple benefits and multiple things off the one patch of land is what I'd like to point to as being one of the other advantages of no-kill cropping. On some other videos that you'll be able to see on the net and so forth, we'll talk about the harvest of graw, which is actually baling up combination of grass and straw. And also the fact that when we look at a picture like that not only are we harvesting in the commercial crop, but we're also bringing into the harvesting machinery a lot of native seeds. And we're currently working with Indigenous groups to better utilise those native seeds from the native grasses underneath. And of course, there are carbon implications. If you're growing more stuff and you're disturbing less, so therefore not emitting carbon dioxide, let alone not reducing your usage of fossil fuels to less than 10% of what it would be otherwise, you've got really quite a whole great beneficial picture here that feeds a lot of different uses. So multiple reasons for doing stuff, multiple benefits, and a very, 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 very positive opportunity there, and one that I'm very passionate, obviously, for nowadays, and very, very keen to share, but it is only one of the options available to you. So that is the finish of the presentation, and I open it up now for discussion and comment, please, Simone.
Well, I'll ask you all to join me in thanking Bruce. So you can give a Zoom clap if you want to put your cameras back on. Please feel free to give the silent Zoom clap. You might use an emoji, whatever you like to do there. Thank you. Bruce, absolutely amazing to see that work, and I'm a very visual person, so I really appreciated all the photos and the videos to really make sense of what no-kill cropping is essentially all about, and just looks phenomenal. I will open up to questions. So if you've got a question, please feel free to raise your hand and put on your mic, and we can field some questions while we've still got Bruce here with us today. Yep, go for it, George.
Sorry, just muted. Just can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear George okay?
No, I couldn't.
George, we're having trouble with your sound. No. Yeah, if you want to pop it in the chat, perhaps, or you could write it. Yeah, hold it up. I like that. If anyone else has a question. Yeah, Colin, I'll just while George is typing, Colin, if you want to jump on.
Yeah, hi. My question is when I talk to people around here in Thora or Bellingen area, because we've had so much rain, they haven't been able to add a silage crop to feed their stock over winter. So how do you go when you've got really water-soaked soil, and yeah, how do you get that extra crop going?
Great question, thank you. And essentially, for a no-kill crop, the window has closed once you have a full soil moisture profile going. That means that everything's growing, and anything that we introduce will be behind the 8-ball rather than in front of it. And so that's one of the principles of no-kill, that it's actually is done when the soil is dry. Now, not dry to great depth, just the surface layer. So we're seeking to place seeds in there ahead of the germination and growth spurts. So yeah, so a difficult one once you do have the situation that you have there now to chase it out. Over time, what we're hoping to get in, especially paddocks that tend to be waterlogged and that sort of thing as a general condition there, is being able to put seed in there when, if you were doing a wet sowing process, you would not have many chances. And of course, machinery travelling over wet soil will always be providing a compactive effect on the soil, and often to great depth, where it is much more difficult to remediate. It's quite a bit different than the compactive source impacts that livestock have, because they're more concentrated in the soil surface layers, and you can address that. So yes, I think for the moment, no-kill isn't something there for the immediate answer, unfortunately.
Thanks, Bruce. And I hope that answers that one, Colin, for you. Yep. Okay, and we've got, and sorry, that's Sam, isn't it? That's Sam and Georgina there. Yeah. So I've just got a few questions here in the chat, Bruce. So the first one, what do you do to the country pre-planting?
Yeah, great question. And that's a really good analytical question to point out the sort of fundamental differences between, say, pasture cropping no-kill cropping. So with pasture cropping, we'd have a set of answers there of what you did prior to sowing. With no-kill, it's essentially nothing or a lot, anything on the whole range of what you would be doing in there. And in general, whatever you're doing with your grazing management over the top, because it's one of the 5 principles of no-kill, is that animals will be involved in this system to keep nutrient flows ticking over. Yes, you don't have to reduce the material. And it varies in places. A quick example of that would be if one is living in a cold area, there might be some need to reduce the standing material down so that you get enough sunlight coming in to that situation for soil warmth, especially if it was late into the autumn time in an Australian context. Out where I live, that we have enough sun and so forth that won't be an issue. So no, you don't have to get stuff down in the, especially in that second video that we showed today. It was pretty apparent that grassland was pretty much up to waist high, and we were sowing straight into that and get an exceptional crop out of there.
Thanks, Bruce. But number 2, do you use any biology on the seed?
We haven't, to this point, haven't had the need for it, but open book on that. If that gives you a result, and you should test for it, that's the simple thing, isn't it? Please do the experiment. If you're already using biological products on your seed or thinking of it, well, always have a test thing. So if you're already using it, don't treat every bit of seed with that, because you should have a test strip of untreated seed just to make a comparison. Likewise, if you're inclined to use it and you haven't been using it at all, well then I'm very keen on you conducting those experiments with a little caveat. I'm really, really enthusiastic about any experiments, but on a whole farm basis, they need to be easy and cheap, because if they're neither of those two things, you can't afford to do many experiments. I think Professor Stuart Hill always indicated the farmers should have at least a dozen experiments going per year, but you won't be doing that if they're expensive or difficult.
And we've got question 3. What disc machine do you use?
Yes, great question. There's, heaven knows, probably 100 or more different types of disc machinery that one could place underneath seed delivery machines, whether they be combines or air seeders. And there's only a subset of the total that would suit with no-kill. The basic principle, if I'm directing my hands here, is that we want straight running coulter equipment running in the direction. We don't want coulters that are shifting soil, and we don't want expensive machinery. So there are various different makes there, and I won't, because this is a government-funded project, I won't be telling you the commercial suppliers, but what you're looking for is simple, because simple means cheap for you in the long run. Complicated and flash, well, maybe that will help some people's egos, but it doesn't help your bottom line in the long run. You want straight running coulter equipment. Generally speaking, we're talking 2 discs, which are tilted out at the top with a seed delivery tube. Some models have the seed delivery in front of the disc, some have them behind. We've got some videos up on the web there where Angus Morris does a good description of how straight running coulter discs operate. And the straight running bit about it is so that you get zero disturbance. We're not about shifting soil about, because if you start shifting soil, one thing you're doing, of course, is inhibiting and disturbing soil processes there. Think about fungal threads and all of that spread through the landscape, but also you're making an opportunity, an opening for competitive plants to the ones that you've actually sown. So disturbing soil isn't really an optimal thing, and in the case of no-kill, you'll actually get pretty poor results if you end up with that. But if you've got a machine available that's less than optimal, but it's there and available for you, well, you can still have a bit of a go with some disc machinery into a pasture.
Thanks, Bruce. We'll go to Nidia now, and I know Colin's got another question before we come back to Sam and Georgina. Yeah. So thanks, Nidia.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks so much for your time today, Bruce. I don't know much about cropping. I'm more small scale, but I had a question about when you're harvesting, grass as well as your crop. Is there any issues with what's the word? I don't know, the grasses interrupting the crop that you've harvested? That's a word
Right.
for it.
Yes, yeah, good question. There's a practical implication in very wet spring times, in that you can have the very lushly growing grass, which is all very green, in amongst the crop, which is very dry, and it can become a bit hard for the actual machine to do the cutting. There can be that sort of an issue. Otherwise, the material that we take through the machine will do a secondary separation on that if we want the components separate, if that's an advantage. If it's all just, if we were choosing to feed it all to stock, well, that mix of things is a much more attractive thing for livestock, because it's got the extras in it. It's not just one boring thing, and so that's an advantage. But what I indicated is the exciting part that I'm interested in the future now, and working with other groups, is that those native of grasses, a lot of which are perennials, some will be annuals, some things will come and go, is that if we're harvesting that's an incredible local product to Australia and the region you're in, which is an additional foodstuff that essentially most of the time just goes back out on the field. And so think about poppy seeds on top of a bread, or sesame seeds and that sort of thing. It's that componentry that might make a really interesting addition to our foods in the future, and give us a whole range of things that at the moment we're just not even getting access to. There's an exciting set of products, because in my view, no-kill has a lot of advantages, but what we'd like to see is actually more and more grasslands retained around Australia and around the world, because believe it or not, they're in most cases the most threatened ecosystems, even much more so than a lot of forest systems and so forth, because they've been replaced by standard agriculture, which takes them down to virtually nothing there of the original components. We've got to give people a reason to keep complexity in the field, or else you can't blame anybody for making rational economic decisions. So if we can give them systems that have a range of products while they're still growing their standard thing, this comes along as an additional co-benefit, then we can really make a case for keeping more grasslands intact, which I might quickly say affects everything else. The majority of catchments are grasslands to one description or another, right? Or they're thickly forested. There's a range in there, but all of that feeds into river systems, which then, of course, feeds horticulture and all of our recharge of water underneath and the whole thing. So the more that we can encourage grasslands by there being an economic benefit and multiple products, then the community in total is going to benefit. Thanks for your question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nidia. Colin, did you have another question there?
Yeah, thanks, Simone. Bruce, I just wanted to ask you, you had a grass in place and then you're adding an annual. How does carbon sequestration, if that's the right pronunciation, go into assisting that? How do you sequester carbon into the soil And how does that keep mounting up if you're putting annuals in, which will die off every year?
Yep. Great question. Because we retain the existing perennials and the full componentry of everything else. In fact, we're actually slightly enhancing running that carbon cycle a bit more. The real ones that, if you like, and it's probably, I shouldn't even use that word once, the whole system drives long-term carbon storage if it's varied. The science is becoming more and more clear on that. So an example of, I'll just quickly give you of high biomass, but it not being stored long-term, is actually modern cropping systems which retain stubble for the last 20 or 30 years. They've been retaining stubble, but yet carbon in soil has continued to deplete because it gets reutilised fast. So it's actually that diversity in the perennial plants punching down to depth as well, that we get complex molecules stored there which aren't then as readily chewed up by the next set of microbes when there's moist soil. So it's a great question, and yet again another, if you like, co-benefit, but also that's really well supported by science in the broad. If we want to store carbon, we need to reinstitute long-term forests, shrublands, grasslands, and because they're always the benchmark. If they're measuring carbon storage in a regular cropping soil, they go to the local roadside that's never been cropped or grazed for the comparison site. There's an operational grassland where you can head towards. And so I would presume, and depending on how all the carbon markets go and that sort of thing, there's a great opportunity for people to take degraded sites if they can join into a carbon scheme, because you're taking it from very low, and not only are you accumulating carbon, but you're trying to make profit along the way, which is always really big, important thing in my book as an analyst for folks that we making jumps in agriculture often is just so risky and so expensive, and therefore rather let's step towards building everything, which is economic viability as well as rebuilding a grassland, because a lot of microbes and the whole situation don't get built in a day. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was ecology. We have to keep on reinstating it over a number of years so that more and more complexity keeps on arriving in the system. An easy way to measure this is just on top of the ground by eye, really, because every time you're seeing new plants arrive and new fluctuations in that of course means that you've been successful in bringing more ingredients to the table. Thank you.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Great question, Colin. Thank you. I've just got one in the chat from Amanda Scott. Bruce, what do you see as the main barriers currently preventing farmers from adopting no-kill cropping?
Oh, that's a really excellent question, and thanks for that, Amanda. Because in my experience, and it's only 26 years of promoting this, is that by far some of the largest barriers are people's attitude to what they see out in front of them. So what I mean by that is that native Australian grasslands are going to look messy, and that for a lot of people is just almost a complete brick wall, right? So that's not me being judgmental on them whatsoever, because let's face it, us humans do like things neat and tidy to one degree or another, and it actually takes quite some readjustment to look at a paddock and watch it actually start to re-wild. And so it is wild, and it is changing, and it's not uniform, and it is going to look very, very different, and quite likely too that you'll be getting plenty of ribbing or worse at the local pub or social engagement, as the neighbours look maybe sometimes in horror with you re-wilding while they're still trying to keep everything neat. That's we're dealing with some real human factors here, and that that's been the major hurdle over the years that I've encountered. Access to machinery can be an issue for folks, and we're seeking to address that with the grassland grain system in the long run, where people could share machinery in local areas. And the only way that would work is if we can get money for people producing grain that has local provenance. So that's one thing I'd like to point out as being a really big deal for the future, is that if you're producing grain in a complex situation, it is going to have a more complex and subtle and nuanced set of nutrients with it. The science supports that contention totally. So therefore, grain growers, instead of just selling all their stuff into a great big pile that all goes in together, you become a little bit more like winemakers, where it might be producing Chardonnay, but my Chardonnay is very different than somebody else's Chardonnay because of the differences in the whole soil, but it's the ecosystem that's supporting the soil underneath. So in the long run, those are sort of the things that I point out, that there's still some hurdles to acceptance, and it's pretty radically different from the norm. So that's probably the biggest one.
Thanks, Bruce. Thank you.
Pleasure.
And I'll just ask a couple more from Sam, and then I'll head over, Glenn, if that's okay.
That's fine.
We've just got one about.
I just add something
sure,
to just add something what Bruce said. One of the things that I talk about, which adds on to what Bruce is, we need to be comfortable with the apparent chaos of the nature. It comes from what Bruce said, looking at grasslands, but also this comes into thinking about diversity and what we're managing, and specifically around what we would not what conventionally would be classed as weeds. And people will see those weeds and go, oh, it doesn't look right, I'll have to get rid of it, rather than thinking, what service is that plant providing to the ecosystem? And I heard Stuart Andrews talk the other day and saying, unless you are willing to replace the service that plant has provided, then probably best to leave it there. But it's that getting comfortable with that apparent chaos of nature that I think is a big hurdle in psychologically getting used to some of these new practices.
Absolutely agree. Another thing that I would say, just completely echoing there Glenn's thoughts, that every plant brings different nutrients in different concentrations at different times to the soil surface. And those processes, if you can harness those to the landscape as well as your own needs, then you're accentuating the total cycling and continuing to build more helpers on your journey, rather than those same plants being perhaps hindering your journey.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Sam and Georgina have just asked also, have you ever taken carbon level tests over the period, Bruce? Not to a monitoring basis, no, not really. We've had done sporadic tests. One and it's a good question. So I can't tell you from where you can go 2 or 4, because that, and also even if there wasn't an individual answer here, that would be so individualised versus what pertains in your soil type and climatic zone. The possibilities of building carbon have a lot of variables feeding into that. And then, of course, the not only the capturing, but the storage of it is the second part. And I think basically the science keeps on settling out on that you don't get to store that in the soil too much if you're running simplified systems. It's very, very difficult. So great example of that would be the very, very high trash loads on sugarcane, where it can sometimes be 30 tonnes to the hectare of dry matter, a huge bulk layer, and it gets eaten down by microbes and incorporated into the soil each year. But yet carbon levels in the Australian
context haven't really gone anywhere in that. So massive amount of biomass doesn't necessarily equate to anything like a massive amount of carbon.
And what's your average yield in a good season?
Right. So I might I'll broaden it out to Australia wide. The experience is whichever zone you're in, your expectation should be compared to the conventional in your area, 1/4 to 1/3 maximum of the grain yield. Okay, so this is just grain yield we're talking about. If we talk about total biomass produced over the year, you'll outdo the conventional farmers consistently year on year. So there's obviously you're retaining all that material there in the grassland, so you've still got to make some dollars out of it. So that's why one of the reasons why animals are important in the system, because if you don't have animals there in that system, you're not making money out of that additional biomass that you're producing versus the conventional. So if you're using a grain yield figure compared to your conventional neighbours of about 1/4 of grain yield, that'll be a good rule of thumb. On the other side, on the input side, your inputs will be very much in the low 10%, if that, compared to your conventional farmers. So you can do the trade-off between that situation. So there'd be places where on economics alone, no-kill couldn't be justified because of a high yield potential consistently in those areas. On economics alone, you couldn't justify it because the high yield is going to support a high lot of inputs coming in, and it's still going to be a big profit. Whereas some other places, especially if they're if you think of the marginal areas of the cropping zone, then high inputs are a great way of going broke fast because you're not going to produce a crop every year. And also another position that no-kill has a good niche for is high slope areas, where you shouldn't be disturbing those in any way, shape or form, but as long as you get the machinery there, you can still go and overlay a no-kill crop. So horses for courses, and not being a complete zealot, think about systems and proportions of your property. A lot of properties have a lot of small areas that they're not actually making the most of because they haven't got an opportunity to put another layer on there in an economic and logistically easy way.
Got a couple more from Sharon and Georgina. What's your paddock sizes?
Right, our individual paddock sizes here are in the old terms about 20 to 50 acres average, so that's 8 to 12 hectares, yeah, so that's our particular circumstance. I would suggest that sort of any answer on that little bit to be avoided because we're just getting down into practices rather than principles. You know, if we're looking for grazing principles and things like that, how many subdivisions do you have per mob in your area, right? Well, that's all relative, of course, to your farm and how much you can afford. And then also the other part that I do, of course, is self-herding work. So if you can't afford to put in fences and that sort of thing, you can still begin a process of starting to move the animals and to actually utilise holistic management principles without having to put in an investment. So once again, not either or, think about all of these things. What can we use as tools to magnify, multiply what you want to do?
And we've just got one final one, thanks Bruce, from Sam and Georgina. How many hectares do you plant?
Right, this year now, because going on to the next generation, I was getting very lazy about planting, but he's done 800 hectares on our 1,600 hectare place this year. So our property maximum would be about 1,200 hectares that we could so in total, if we were doing every bit. So it's about 2/3 of what we could do. Yep.
Thank you. And Glenn, you got your hand up, a question or comment?
Yeah, I just thought I'd come back to a couple of things that Bruce was talking about, and one was doing trials. And I know with my group, and I'm pretty sure Brian probably would have brought it up with his group, is implementing safe to fail trials in doing anything that we're doing. So whether it's our grazing management or whether it's weed control, or in this case, looking at how you could implement the principles of no-kill cropping. Leading on from that, one of the things I think for the areas that we're dealing with, Bruce, is that we're dealing with areas that very rarely would have in a unicorn average year dry soil. But what I think you need to then look at, or that you guys need to look at, is what are we trying? The principle here is adding additional diversity to help us build the system from where it is. So I've been working with a number of people across the tablelands and the coastal areas in looking at how we can use the principles of no-kill cropping and adding in forage crops into the system in times of the year when we have otherwise low productivity. So for us on the tablelands areas, it's generally during our winter when the paradigm is that nothing grows in the frost, so you don't bother, but we are bucking that paradigm quite considerably. And the same right over into Dorrigo and Bellingen and now up into the north coast. You get a look at what times of the year have you got your low forage areas to give you opportunity to say, well, how can we support the biology? How can we support diversity and measure our increase over time? In doing that, part of our safe to fail is to look at trialing what plants we can implement. Now, Bruce is talking about harvesting grain crops. A lot of us probably wouldn't be in the position to harvest that grain crop, but we can harvest forage utilising animals as we need to. But there's a whole range of different plants available through the seed suppliers that we can have access to. What we need to do is find out which ones suit our soil, our environment, our management practices, the equipment that we have, all of those sorts of things. So, for example, we've been doing trials with what we can do rather than direct drilling, which, if you've got the equipment, is a great way to get things established. But what can we do by broadcasting seed into existing pastures at different times of the year in terms of what we can get to grow? And it's a matter of trialing different seed types that you can get into those systems to be able to get that productivity. So, spend $100, $200 on 5 or 6 different types of seed mixes and singles and put them out and see what comes up, and then you can then move on from that. So I just thought I'd add that in to contextualize for the situation that we're in with you guys in predominantly grazing operations, and also in situations where we're not going to have particular times of the year where you will have you'll be able to dry sow. That's one added in. So we've been using the principles of what Bruce has been talking about in no-kill cropping, and I think the key is that we're adding diversity to an existing system. And I know there are a lot of people talking about pasture cropping and multi-species cropping and those sorts of things where they're developing soil, but part of the process is to kill out what they've currently got, add in annuals for a couple of years, and then replant perennials. I don't see the logic in that, and I'm sure Bruce wouldn't see any logic in that. What we're trying to do is support that existing system to build and continually add to the diversity of what we've got. And from that diversity, we get huge benefits from all of that. Different root structures and different plants growing at different times of year, different energy capture, minerals flowing, water being captured, all those sorts of things. So, thanks, Bruce.
Double thumbs up from me. Yeah. Absolutely agree with all of that. Yeah.
Thanks, Glenn. Thanks, Bruce. Are there any more questions? We've probably got time for one more. If there's any more questions from the call. Just keep an eye out if any hands being raised. Yeah, Brian?
Hi, Simone. Thanks very much. Simone, I'd just like to thank Bruce very much for sharing his stories. And again, underline how important sharing of stories is. So, yeah, it's huge knowledge, but thanks very much, Bruce, for sharing your stories. And again, just capturing more sunlight all the time. Fantastic. Thanks, mate.
Thank you, Brian, for the comment.
Okay, well, if that's it from everyone, I would just like to extend huge appreciation to Bruce for coming along and joining us today and sharing all of that wisdom. I hazard a guess that you could take each of those elements and just talk about them for almost days to even start to, you know, scratch the surface, so to speak, of yeah, as Brian shared, like the wealth of your experience and through your stories of putting all of this into practice over that time, over the last 20 plus years, as you've shared. So yeah, I know everyone here will really appreciates your time. I have recorded the session, so we can go back and listen and re-listen to parts as well if there's anything you wanted to revisit. And I think that's it. So thanks again, Bruce, and thanks everyone for joining us live today.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Cheers for now.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks,
Thank you,
Simone.
Bruce.
Thank you, Bruce. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Thank you, Simone.